Hello, folks. Welcome back to English 408, Introduction to Literary Criticism. This will be a video lecture for Module 7 over postcolonialism, postcolonial criticism, or postcolonial theory. All of those are used interchangeably. This particular theoretical approach will really benefit from our examination discussion of feminism and Marxism, as you will see. In broad strokes, I simply mean that if feminism is really concerned with people who of a certain sex or gender are oppressed, then postcolonial theory and postcolonial criticism is concerned with people of different nationalities and geographies, ethnicities who are oppressed. And likewise, Marxism, as we learned last time, is concerned about people who are economically oppressed, which cuts across all geographic and ethnic and racial lines. So I will, as typical, read or discuss the readings in order here. We'll first look at the handout, then some of Barry's chapter, then Said's Orientalism, and Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Now, technically, Fanon, Frantz Fanon here, comes before Said, but as you will see from the handout I'll discuss in a moment, Said's notion of Orientalism and the other and whatnot really kind of lay the framework for what Fanon was talking about. So here I have these questions and or authors out of chronological order, but hopefully this structure will make sense as I unfold it. So this coming fall, I'm slated to teach English 420 comparative literature, which, as you can see, I haven't done in quite some time. And therefore, theoretically, none of you have taken this course or taken it with me, because the topic changes every time. And I always teach it from a kind of both post-colonial and racial ethnic perspective, as you can see here, erasing racism. And in a number of works that I assign, they're all novels and film, we cover a number of countries and continents. So, this novel of the Mexican Revolution discusses people who are oppressed, by and large, native or people of native Aztec and Mayan heritage in the Mexican Revolutionary War in the early 20th century. The Untouchables, it's about the Dalit class, or the literal outcast in India. So that's on the sub-Asian continent. This Rabbit-Proof Fence novel is about native Aboriginal or native Australians fleeing the oppression of colonial Australian rule. And these two novels are set in Africa with this beautifully written novel, Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. It's this kind of braided novel, as the two women here suggest. That is, part of it is set in present-day Ghana, in colonial times in Africa, and then the other part is set in the kind of southern US and eastern seaboard though the author Yagyasi, her parents are from Ghana. She's actually American and was, I think, born and raised in Alabama. Titi Dengarama's nervous condition here is about a young woman growing up in Zimbabwe, which was formerly known as Rhodesia, colonized by the Brits and the Dutch. And it's about her trying to fit into a very complicated culture. So I'm very interested in sharing these ideas and concepts with you. So if post-colonial criticism and theory strikes your fancy, there'll be more for you to investigate and explore in these texts in fall of 2022. So this is the handout, if you will, for post-colonial criticism, post-colonial theory. And on the front page, I have a bunch of images that I will return to in our discussion here. But the images are to try to get you to visualize and conceptualize what is going on here with first colonialism, which is, clearly the oppression of one native people by another, either through economic and or military prowess. So this is a map, as you can see here, of the world according to the British Empire in 1886. And I will unpack that map in a little bit. This is a famous cover from National Geographic, and it's not of what you might think of as, a Caucasian person with fair skin and green eyes, but it's actually an Afghani woman. And I'll explain that in a little bit. This kind of romanticization here in this image by Frederick Lewis of the harem or harem is part and parcel of what Edward Said talks about in terms of the Orientalism going on of the West, of the East by the West. We, by virtue of coming from Western culture or having our roots in European education and values, we are part of the West. And William Blake, the poet's image here of Europe supported by Africa and America, kind of clear nod to, British imperialism, but also an acknowledgement that without the support of the other, capital O, that Britain would not exist where it is today. So postcolonial theory assumes that history is rarely presented objectively, so that one must reclaim, recover, and contextualize one's origins. So some might call it revisionist history, which is really a negative term. For example, revisionist history, or those who believe in a kind of revisionist history perspective might say, oh, well, the Holocaust during World War II of killing 6+ million Jews never really occurred. It's all a conspiracy, fabrication, fake news. That's revisionist history in a negative light. But because, that old adage, history is written by the victor, because history typically does not give a fair shake to those who are conquered or oppressed, then it's rarely presented objectively. So the post-colonial critic theorist wants to recover accurately what the history was and has been. The reclamation of history can in turn be used to subvert hegemony's construction of the other. So last time during Marxist criticism talked about hegemony, which is the dominant values and ideology of the ruling class, and every culture, society has a hegemony. And here's that usage of other with a capital O that we'll look at more closely here in a moment. And once you reclaim history and realize that it is biased and subjective, then you can subvert or undermine or overthrow what the ruling class, the hegemony, has written about, society. Currently, we're undergoing this right now with this absurd, what do you call it? Reaction against, sorry, my dyslexia kicking in. It's something called the 1619 Project, and many of you probably know that 1619 is when, at least as far back as we're able to tell, the first actual Africans transported across the Atlantic set foot on, what is present-day American soil, North America. But there's this project largely spearheaded by, what's her name? Hannah Nicole Jones. And there's this, Nicole Hannah Jones, a very prominent journalist. And this is now this 1619 Project, along with what's called critical race theory, which we'll talk about next time, the next module. It's being, rejected in white, largely, sectors and conservative sectors, because, people think like, oh, well, you shouldn't be teaching this, what they would otherwise call biased history of America, because it, either makes little Susie and Johnny uncomfortable, or it, supposedly is not giving a fair shake to, the white people, so to speak. So you can go to check out this project itself. It's pretty interesting. Anyway, so I just wanted to point that out, that we're still undergoing this kind of, trying to subvert hegemony's construction, and there's a backlash against it because people don't want to give up their privileged place in history. Also, postcolonial theory assumes that issues of race, region, religion, nationality, and culture should be viewed not from a universal, essentialist, monolithic perspective, but from a particularized and relative perspective. That is, you can't say, as I have actually heard in class sometimes, that, oh, this person comes from a Caribbean island, and you ask that person, oh, do you walk around in a bathing suit all the time? Do you live in a hut? That's just taking this fairly crass, stereotypical view of people who live on an island and applying it blanketly across all Caribbean islands, or saying the same thing, which I have pretty much heard of from students Grambling from Kenya or Cameroon or Nigeria, and Southern US students will ask them in class, so do you guys have TV? Do you guys, have stores and malls? Like, it's this very myopic, short-sighted view of what people in various continents and countries experience. So we don't want to have this universalized essentialist. Remember, essentialism is typically a bad thing because you're reducing something down to a supposed essence, but you can't say all Africans right, which encompasses many, many countries, have the same experiences. Just like you can't say all Americans have the same experiences. Excuse me. So I include another image here on the top of the second page of this handout that comes from the Calcutta Journal. Calcutta, or Kolkata now, is a city in northeastern India. And you may know that beginning in the late 1600s, the Brits began to colonize northern India and had a fairly strong hold up until the mid 1900s. And so this is, as the caption says, physiognomy and the facial line. So physiognomy itself is basically a bogus, what we might call pseudoscience. And we got to keep in mind, 1821, this is the beginning of the medical profession as we know it, with medical schools and whatnot, but it purported to be an actual science, right? So what it tried to do was look at someone's face or cranial structure, and your face or your cranium would in turn supposedly infer what kind of character and thus morality you had, right? As you can see here, it was looking at features of the body, especially the face. So when you see this image here, it goes from, I'm going to go backwards here, from the Grecian antique, right? Letter H here, of what, if you look at statues, which we have of Greeks, of what size, shape, form the cranium and the face looks like. According to letter G, it's the beau or beautiful ideal of Roman painters later, which you can certainly see in statues and paintings of Roman antiquity. You go to the basic European, letter F, and the Asiatic, or person from Asia, which again encompasses many, many different peoples and ethnicities. Here you begin to see that the head begins to be smaller, and generally speaking, Asians are, in terms of stature, physique, smaller than many Europeans or African people, though there are actually many tall Asians, 6 foot and taller. And then it gets into letter D, is the, notice again, 1821, the American, not Indian, but the American savage here. You can see with like a, feather in the back. And the head begins to be, again, smaller and more sloped. And then eventually to the Negro, the orangutan, and the monkey. And therefore, this fairly blatantly racist and offensive schematic, if you will, going from right here, letter H, to A, is supposedly, in again, this pseudoscience realm of the early 1800s, early 19th century, is supposedly objectively, though not, because again, it's a pseudoscience, objectively showing that this is why people of color or people we might otherwise deem as barbaric or savages are, brutes, or, they're not like we sophisticated, cultured, moral Europeans, right? So with that kind of, background, let's look at some of the, not all of these, but some of the key terms in discussion of postcolonial theory. And I guess the first one to look at is this word alterity. And it can be used interchangeably with the word other. In its kind of fundamental use, alter as in, the sense of change, of something that's, different from something else, is a term that is largely coined here by Gayatri Spivak, who's Indian from India, literary theorist. She also uses the term subaltern, as you can see the root of the word altern there. So alterity is the state of otherness, okay, because it's, as ity, it's a noun, so you got to have the noun form there. It's typically imposed through the ideology of Orientalism, which we'll look at in a second, though it can be applicable to any category or group of peoples or to an individual who is seen to exhibit characteristics of otherness, whether through religion, gender, ethnicity, etc. So otherness can be any kind of sense of difference, right? Race, sex, gender, ethnicity, religion, so on. So since this was mentioned, Orientalism, let's look at what it is up here. So this author's name is, I know it looks like the word said, but as you will learn, Edward Said is how you pronounce it. Edward Said is actually born in Palestine, or present day Eastern Israel. And thus is technically what we might call an Arab. So you would not say said, you would say Said. So as Said puts it, it is, quote, this is from him, a manner of regularized or orientalized writing, vision, and study dominated by imperatives, perspectives, and ideological biases, ostensibly or seemingly suited to the Orient. So keep in mind that what he's really kind of driving at here is that the concept and project and manifestation of Orientalism, which postcolonial theorists and critics rely on to critique a text, it's really a kind of network, if you will, of writing, of vision, meaning like images, as we will see, of study, like of scholarship and things published. And it's dominated by imperatives, by like things you must believe about other people, perspectives, and ideological biases. Remember that, from Marx, which is why this is a nice kind of segue from Marxism from last time. From Marx and Engels, they believe that ideology is a false consciousness, an upside down version of what is true. Think of, the Matrix, for example. Orientalism is the image, or simulacrum, as Baudrillard might say. Simulacrum is the simulated thing by the French theorist Jean Baudrillard. Normally I teach an entire component on postmodernism, and we discuss Baudrillard and the simulacrum, but we don't have time this semester because of both the Mardi Gras break and spring break. And so Orientalism is the image of the Orient, right? Of this concept of, we've probably heard that term, like, the Orient Express, this train somewhere in Asia, expressed as an entire system of thought and scholarship. So when you see the word Orientalism, it is, yes, a mindset, but it's also, as Said is conjecturing, it is a system and a network of thought and scholarship. And the Orient itself, as a category concept, right, it signifies a system of representation framed by political forces that brought the Orient into Western learning, Western consciousness, and Western empire. the Orient exists for, is constructed by, and in relation to the West. So I'll read that one more time. The concept, the category of the Orient exists for, is constructed by, and in relation to the West. Remember, we comprise part of the West as the literal Western hemisphere that was conquered, colonized by various European powers. And therefore, the Orient is a mirror image of what is inferior and alien or other to the West. So what Said is going to do is he's going to kind of divide the world into two, if you will, into what he calls the Occident and the Orient. Where is that here? Is it not in this? My computer's taking forever. So it's curiously not in here, but it's not hard to understand. Barry talks about it in his chapter. So if the West is well, I thought it was for sure Barry. There, right in front of me. If the West is the Occident, right? Think of, where I mentioned last time, talking about Marx and referring to Barack Obama and how he became educated. He became initially started at a place in California called Occidental College. And thus, because California is in the West, it's about as, except for Hawaii and Alaska, is about as far west as you can go. Right, so he went to Occidental College, which, as you can see, is basically in California. So if we think of Occidental as the West, right, then for Said, the Middle East and the Far East become the Orient. And that's what I meant a second ago, where Said basically draws the world in two, because we, the West, have done that, as he kind of convincingly shows. So there's this one last notion that is important to think about in terms of postcolonialism, and it's hybridity. Other terms that today people use that kind of come after hybridity, which comes from this theorist named Homi Bhabha, are things like a biracial person or a multiracial person, right? But hybridity doesn't just extend to race. It can extend to what we call subjectivities, nationalities, ethnicities. So if someone identifies as non-binary and Jewish and from, say, Africa, which is entirely possible, let's say South Africa, then that person we could probably categorize as hybrid. In other words, they're not one thing, they're a kind of conglomeration of many things. And really, to be honest, I would argue that as Homi Bhabha does, that everyone and everything is hybrid. There's no such thing as any kind of purity anymore. Some people want to maintain that perspective. All right, well, let's move to Barry, and he has a kind of interesting take on, in his reading anyway. He does toward the end a reading of Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park, which I can't say that you all have read, so we're not going to really talk much about it. I'll discuss it in a minute, but I might want us to think about again Poe's The Oval Portrait, right? So postcolonial criticism, emerges in the 1990s. However, its roots are much further back, as we will see. One significant effect of postcolonial criticism is to further undermine the universalist, you could say essentialist or monolithic claims once made on behalf of literature by liberal humanist critics. This term right here, folks, if we recall, should take you all the way back to our very first module on new critics, right? Because what does, in that Barry chapter, the theory before theory, what does he call the new critics? He calls them liberal humanists, right? So we in America call them the new critics, but that term is somewhat interchangeable. So what Barry is pointing out here is that we are in, as the kind of trajectory of this course is showing, we're in a project of dismantling and undermining and correcting, if you will, the problems of literary humanist critics and or new critics, where they would claim that, literature is timeless, like Shakespeare, right? He goes on to say, if we claim that great literature has a timeless and universal significance, again, think of Shakespeare, we thereby demote or disregard cultural, social, regional, and national differences in experience and outlet, preferring instead to judge all literature by a single, supposedly universal standard. So this is why there's often in English departments pushback to the notion that students should be required, for example, to take Shakespeare as a course. Why not students be required to take a course in, I don't know, Frederick Douglass or Phyllis Wheatley or any other number of, Zora Neale Hurston, any other number of people who have not typically been afforded the kind of privileged place that Shakespeare has been. So moving on here. This universalism or essentialism is rejected by postcolonial criticism. Whenever a universal signification or meaning is claimed for a work, then white Eurocentric norms and practices are being promoted by a sleight of hand to this elevated status, and all others correspondingly relegated to subsidiary marginalized roles, right? So again, think of Shakespeare. If you say that, Shakespeare has always been taught and therefore it's in the kind of cultural, literacy of people to know Shakespeare, then postcolonial critics will say that's a kind of Eurocentric and white bread, sleight of hand to say that, well, simply because it's done in the past, therefore we should do it again, right? I mean, you could use that logic and say, well, it's simply because slavery was done in the past, we should do it again. Clearly, that's illogical. The next two paragraphs here kind of encapsulate the two main forces in postcolonial theory. And he takes them chronologically, again, in the syllabus or module 6. I take them sort of out of order. But as you can see, in 1961, Fanon comes before the Orientalism of Said's work in 1978. The ancestry of postcolonial criticism can be traced to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. By the way, this text here is the entire work is in the postcolonial folder. So you have this work. I recommend you add it to your library. It's free to you to download. The portion that we have that's an excerpt really in the Norton anthology comes from this chapter 4 on national culture. Going back to Barry, it was published in 1961 and voicing what might be called cultural resistance to France's African empire. I'm going to pause there for a second and come back to this paragraph to kind of visualize or concretize what Barry sort of assumes you might already know. So in the colonial project of European nations, this map here, as you can see here, around circa 1700, color-coded with various countries that go out and colonize the world. So let's look at, for example, here in the sort of brown color, Spain is right here. And then you have, this colonization of Nueva España or New Spain, throughout Central America. And then, of course, large portions of South America. So to this day, right, going all the way to California, and California itself and Florida, if you're pronouncing it, with its correct pronunciation, these are Spanish names, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, New Mexico, Nuevo Mexico. It all owes its indebtedness to, the colonization by Spain. The entire, not entire, but largely speaking, country of Mexico and throughout Central America and South America, they speak Spanish and their religion is Catholic. This purple here, represented by Brazil, is coming from this smaller country of Portugal, right? Because in Portugal, they speak what? Portuguese. You can go all the way over here to the Philippines. Philippines is brown, right? Why? Because Spain colonized the Philippines. And if you go to Spain today, or excuse me, the Philippines today, you will see people with Spanish surnames, and their dominant religion is Catholicism, even though it's a Southeastern Asian country. So, this is what was happening in the early kind of exploratory period of, the world. You see here, right, and France is in orange, and then over here, with the entire, kind of conquering of what we call the Louisiana Purchase, right? Even Quebec, large portions of, the US still have French names, Detroit, actually, Lafayette. Certainly, if you just go down to Baton Rouge, right? These are all French names. And there again, you can see the Louisiana Purchase. So what Fanon is talking about, he's born in Martinique, which is this tiny little island here in the we call Lesser Antilles, or the Caribbean islands. And he was, even though he was born in the Caribbean, he was actually interested in what was going on in Africa. So what's crazy is, as you can see here in this bottom image, in 1878, there's kind of a little bit of exploration and footholding, if you will, into Africa by various, British or Portuguese countries and in France. But only 36 years later, so just over 3 decades later, this is what it looks like in 1914, which is called the Scramble for Africa, or the African Partition, where literally in those years, keep in mind that, the middle of the 1800s, or smack dab, as to be reminded by Marx, workers, throw off your chains, unite. We're smack dab in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, when mechanized industries and manufacturing was coming online. So you had, for instance, the steam engine, which drove, railroads and other kinds of manufacturing equipment. And therefore, you had this large push or scramble to come after the natural resources in Africa. So what Fanon was very interested in was in Algeria, right? And you can see here that everything in pink, kind of color coded here, right? Everything in pink, including Madagascar, was being colonized and carved up by, in this case, France. Or everything in green here was being carved up and colonized by Britain, right? So, it's no surprise that, in South Africa, they speak something called Afrikaans, right? But it's a kind of variation of Dutch and English. In Egypt up here, we have a lot of, indebtedness to Egyptian culture. There's actually, a lot of British influence still to this day in Egypt. So this is what Barry was referring to when he said that Fanon here, even though he's from Martinique, island in the Caribbean, is actually concerned with France's African empire. So Fanon, a psychiatrist of Martinique, argued that the first step for colonized people in finding a voice and an identity is to reclaim their own past, right? That goes back to that notion here at the bottom of letter B, right, of reclaiming history, right, to subvert what has been, biasly written. For centuries, the European colonizing power will have devalued the nation's past, especially in history, seeing its pre-colonial era as a pre-civilized limbo, or even as a historical void, right? Like, there's nothing in Africa. I mean, if you go back and look at very, very early maps of Africa, Europeans didn't know what was there. They sort of knew the contours of the continent and various ports on the coast, but they didn't know the internal, Africa, like the Congo, for that matter, or Lake Victoria, named after a colonizing queen, Queen Victoria. Children, both Black and white, will have been taught to see history, culture, and progress as beginning with the arrival of the Europeans, right? This, again, speaks to that 1619 project I was mentioning ago with Nicole Hannah-Jones, whereby, how dare you teach that, America's been this very deeply indebted slave holding country, and we can't teach it accurately if we don't talk about the slaves arriving in 1619. I'm of course using the ridiculous reactionary argument of people who are against CRT, or critical race theory now. But that's what's currently happening, right? That we, largely Americans, especially in public schools, have been taught to see history, culture, and progress as beginning with the arrival of the Europeans, right? Think of, yeah, the Pilgrims, right? Yeah, like there was no, wait, there were, multiple African, Native American tribes, or what we call First Peoples, Indigenous peoples here before the Europeans came. Well, of course there were. If the first step towards a post-colonial perspective is to reclaim one's own past, then the second is to erode the colonist ideology, by which that past has been devalued. And when we get to Fanon, that becomes a little trickier, right? To this part, to erode the colonialist ideology, because he's kind of want to have it both ways, to be both, have a national consciousness, but also to be aware of, indebted to its colonial oppressors. The other major book, as Barry points out, is Said's Orientalism. It's another major book, which can be said to inaugurate postcolonial criticism proper, is Edward Said's Orientalism, 1978, which is a specific expose of the Eurocentric universalism, which takes for granted both the superiority of what is European or Western. Notice right there, European or Western, right? So those ideas and concepts, categories are used interchangeably in postcolonial criticism, and the inferiority of what is not. Said identifies a European cultural tradition of Orientalism, which is a particular and long-standing way of identifying the East as other and inferior to the West. The Orient, he says, features in the Western mind, which we, having been educated and have a government predicated on Western cultural values and systems, is a sort of surrogate or stand-in and even underground self, right? It's the Orient is not a real thing. It's obviously a fake, made-up construct by Westerners. This means, in effect, that the East, and he's talking about everything from literally the border of, say, present-day Europe, all the way to the Far East, as in Japan and Kamchatka in Russia, everything in Asia, basically. That the East becomes a repository or projection of those aspects of themselves which Westerners do not choose to acknowledge: cruelty, sensuality, decadence, laziness, and so on. This, by the way, that the East becomes a projection, right? This is really Freud, if you remember back to Freud, that projection is looking at someone or other people, in this case, groups of people, and sort of unconsciously projecting your inferiorities, your own flaws onto other people. So, again, Freud isn't someone, or his concepts we shouldn't just reject outright because he had a problematic relationship to and with women. But you can see it here in action with postcolonialism, right? That things that Westerners, we colonial powers and colonizers might have, like cruelty and sensuality, decadence, laziness, and so on, we project those onto everyone and everything in the East, right? Or known as the Orient. At the same time, and paradoxically, the East is seen as a fascinating realm of the exotic, the mystical, and seductive. It also tends to be seen as homogeneous, right? As I mentioned earlier, right? when you say someone is from Asia, that's like saying someone is from Africa. Like, well, someone from Morocco is not like someone from Madagascar, and someone from South Africa is not like someone from Egypt. Vastly different peoples, experiences, languages, and so on. And it's true of, you can't say someone in Uzbekistan, which is in the middle of the Asian continent, has the same experiences as someone from Sri Lanka or in Indonesia, right? It's so homogenizing is part of that universalizing, essentializing notion, like, oh, well, what did he look like? The officer asked, and he said, well, he was Asian, or he was Oriental, even worse, right? That's because, we as Americans don't try to bother parsing out, the nuance between, say, a Vietnamese person and a Korean person. They're just Asian to us, right? It also tends to be seen as homogenous, the people there being anonymous masses rather than individuals, their actions determined by instinctive emotions, lust, terror, fury, etc., rather than by conscious choices and decisions. Their emotions and reactions are always determined by racial considerations. They are like this because they are Asiatics or Blacks or Orientals, right? That's there's this kind of going back to that, image here, right? That people of, these categories, right? Asian, Native American, Africans, they behave this way because of their, basic inherent difference, their otherness, rather than by aspects of individual status or circumstance. For instance, because they happen to be a sister or an uncle or a collector of antique pottery. That is, we don't think that people behave this way or that way because of their, think of Marx, what he calls material conditions, but instead we say they behave that way because, for example, they're Arabs, right? Or they're Africans, whatever the heck that means, this kind of broad term. So what do literary critics who practice postcolonial theories do, right? Postcolonial criticism draws attention to issues of cultural difference in literary texts, and is one of several critical approaches we have considered with focus on specific issues, including issues of gender, feminist criticisms, of class, Marxist criticism, and of sexual orientation. And unfortunately, again, like postmodernism, we don't have a whole module time to be able to do queer theory, though we ought to. It's as important as these other theories. So postcolonial critics, they reject claims to universalism made on behalf of canonical or accepted Western literature and seek to show its limitations of outlook, especially its general inabilities to empathize across boundaries of cultural and ethnic difference. So here's an example of looking at, let's not say that it's all the same thing. If we go back to the Poe short story, The Oval Portrait, I'm not sure how nuanced of a reading you all were doing if you read that story, right? Like, ideally, I want to believe as English majors, when you come across a word you don't know, you look it up, right? And so our story, remember, it was originally entitled Life and Death, but he changed it later to The Oval Portrait. Our story begins right here with this sentence in the Barry version. The chateau into which Pedro had ventured into make forcible entrance rather than permit me, okay? But even at the beginning, you have this word, the Apennines, right? Which maybe you already know where that is or what that is, right? But if you didn't, hopefully you would have looked it up. this sentence, which is a very long sentence, right? Ending with Mrs. Radcliffe here is an actual author, just before Poe's time, but a British author. Says here, this chateau into which Pedro had ventured to make forcible entrance rather than permit me in my desperately wounded condition to pass a night in the open air. This chateau was one of those fantastic, think of the word fantasy, right? Piles of commingled gloom and grandeur, which have so long frowned among the Apennines, not less in fact than in the fancy of Miss Radcliffe. And fancy here not meaning being pretty, but fancy meaning imagination. So what he's doing is invoking Mrs. Anne Radcliffe, who was thought to have been, one of the, maybe Dr. Clausen or Tracy imparted this information to you if you took a course with them, that Anne Radcliffe was thought to have been one of the progenitors or first authors of what we call the Gothic novel, right? So there she is, right? Credited with, Gothic novels. So Poe was assuming you knew who Anne Radcliffe was in that kind of allusion. But here, this word Apennines, right? That this chateau that they're in is in this, as he says, commingled gloom and grandeur kind of setting. And it's actually in the early version of this story, it's mentioned as well. It begins, because this large section here is not in the version we have that's published as the oval portrait, but it is in this early version. The very first line in the earlier version was, "My fever had been excessive and of long duration." So right away we're wondering, is this person in his right mind if he's feverish, right? "All the remedies attainable in this wild Apennine region have been exhausted to no purpose." So he immediately tells us that he's in the Apennines. And if you didn't know where the Apennines were, you would hopefully look up the word. It is actually a mountain chain in northern Italy, okay? So it kind of goes through most of Italy as opposed to, Sicily and the other islands. So that means that Poe is telling us that he's in this kind of specific place that remember, Poe's an American and his audience is largely American, that it's kind of, an exotic place, or as he says, he uses the word, a fantastical place. That it's not, you don't, in Poe's Baltimore, which is where he largely lived and, wrote, you don't see these, majestic mountains or those, kind of steps, we call them, foothills. So right away, what you can say is, if you're reading this story through a kind of postcolonial lens, right, that Poe is telling us that he's deliberately setting this story not in America where he's from, but he's in this, kind of, for him and most Americans, this fantastic and exotic place of the Italian, not Alps, but, mountain chain. And that kind of gives you a whole window into how then you can read what Poe is trying to get at. And you can read it. They examine the representation of other cultures and literature as a way of achieving this end. If you go back and you look at the story, right, he never names his name, but he does say he has a valet or valet. We say valet, Brits would say valet. And his valet's name is Pedro. Now, if his name was Pierre, right, that would be in keeping with Italian and French naming, but Pedro is Spanish for Peter. All right, he doesn't say Peter, he doesn't say Pierre, he says Pedro, which in turn means that, as we learn, he has, as he tells us, this incipient, right here, this incipient delirium from his fever, his long fever. Therefore, what we can maybe deduce by this, if we look at, where a map is, and, find the Apennines, we find that it's certainly in Italy, right? But Pedro, again, Spanish for Peter, comes from Spain. So it even adds a more kind of exotic, fantastical flair to this story, right? And this is precisely what postcolonial critics are trying to uncover or unravel and point to in a text, saying, like, Poe, who comes from way over here, in Baltimore, if you know where Baltimore is in Maryland, right? It's on the coast here, right there. So that's where Poe mostly lived and wrote. But he's setting a story way over here in the Apennines with a Spanish valet, right? And therefore it kind of pulls at our, perhaps willing suspension of disbelief, as Coleridge might say. Why set this story in a far-flung place, far-flung from, the American seaboard, and why use, this kind of even more obscure Spanish name? Has there been some, kind of war or problem going on at the time? Probably, right? But he never actually names it in the story. Anyhow, that's the kind of reading you might do. And postcolonial critics also, they show how such literature is often evasively and crucially silent. This is important, silent on matters concerned with colonization and imperialism. So imperialism, let me just parse these two out. Colonization is sort of simply just setting up shop in someone else's country, right? You're there to literally live and, impose your religion, language, and values on another people. Imperialism is the economic gain that comes from colonization, right? So again, the rush or scramble for Africa, because it had, and still does, have lots of natural resources. But at the end of this chapter, Barry does, well, he really discusses Edward Said's reading of, so it's not really Barry's reading, but reading of Jane Austen's novel, Mansfield Park. And as I said a moment ago, I would mention this. So, some of you might remember or have read things like let me get the right. You might have read like Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Northanger Abbey, her 6 novels, one of which, of course, is Mansfield Park here, published in 1814. And in it, you can see here, right, she's the author of, but it was, written anonymously. We, of course, now know it was Jane Austen. So Mansfield Park is also like, Pride and Prejudice, and largely speaking, all of her novels. It's about, the marriage market and women trying to find a husband and so on. But what is curious about this novel is that Austen here, she includes the father, his name is Sir Bertram, and we learn that he has, in the novel, he owns land in Caribbean islands, okay? And therefore, the family in the novel, the Russells, I believe, they earned their bread and butter, their existence, off of the backs of slaves in colonized Caribbean islands. But that's never really overtly mentioned by Austen, right? In the novel, she kind of just throws that in there. And what you're seeing here in this map, right, is all of these colonial rule, right? So if you look at everything that is in red belong at one point to some degree to Britain, right? So there's Britain, right, including Ireland and part of Ireland, till the northern part broke off and became separated from Ireland proper. But over here in not all, but most of these Caribbean islands, right, with the exception of a couple like Martinique, where Fanon is from, which is colonized by the French, they at one point or another were colonized by the Brits, as was, of course, the entire eastern portion of what is now known as the United States, and Canada, which is now a Commonwealth country. So Jane Austen doesn't really talk much about, the people down here in the Caribbean islands who are putting money in the pocket of their father back here in Britain, right? And how they're able to buy fancy gowns and go to balls and whatnot, or, have a dowry to give to an eventual husband. She doesn't really say much about that. And that, therefore, post-colonial critics would say, hey, we need to address this kind of just thrown in there notion that they're really existing out the backs of slave labor. This is an image that is in your folder that I mentioned earlier. It's on our handout. And it's similar to the one I showed you a moment ago, but as you can see at the bottom, this is called or entitled, if I can get this out of the way, Imperial Federation, or Map of the World Showing the Extent of the British Empire in 1886, with British territories colored in red. So this is a very curious map. So 1886, Queen Victoria's, still queen. She dies in 1901. And everywhere in red at the time, like that previous map, is sort of colonized or owned by Britain. And therefore, there's this phrase or saying you may have heard that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And what is meant by that is every sort of what we call longitude, every one of these columns that go up and down, as opposed to latitude is left to right. Every longitude, or what we might call time zone, right? Come over here and look at the, the Eastern time zone, Central time zone, so on. That at the time in 1886, that pretty much every single longitude on the planet, there was some territory, country, even, part of a continent up here with Canada, either colonized or owned by Britain. And this is emblematized or symbolized by Britannia, as she is known. So we have Lady Liberty, or the Statue of Liberty. Britannia is a female who's shown here in her armor, with this trident, remind us that they conquer colonies through seagoing navies and the British flag on her shield. But she is being held up by the Greek god Atlas, right? Or in, it says Atlas right here, but even below that, around his neck is human labor, right? Which is true. That Britain and the wealth of Britain from various colonial powers is being propped up literally and figuratively by human labor. Think of Marx again. So as you work your way around the frame or border of this, what you have roughly is this kind of really garish stereotype of people in various regions. So if we're talking about the East and Far East here, of places like, say, Japan and China and Korea and so on, you'll have these caricatures of stereotypes of women from there, or people. And notice again, speaking of what Said was saying, of this kind of exoticized, fantastical, centralized image of the other in the Orient, is, this woman, she's half nude. And down here you have this, what appears to be a Chinese woman, in a kimono, there to serve tea. Think of the Brits and their love for tea. Well, where does tea originally come from? China, and it's still largely one of their main exports. Here of this Southeast Asian woman, perhaps someone from, maybe New Guinea, maybe Malaysia, who knows? It's not clear, but there she is with a big glass of wine, right? Because all these grapes are around there. And thus, it's an intoxicating, literally and figuratively speaking, figure. Down here at the bottom corner, you have this sort of tableau, if you will, related to Australia, which of course, Australia was colonized by, in part at the beginning, what we call conscripts or criminals that were, seen to be unworthy of British and Irish prisons. And the Brits sent these criminals to both New Zealand and Australia. So you have, the Australian colonizer, the woman who looks, for all intents and purposes, like a Brit or Caucasian, juxtaposed to what we would call the Aboriginal Australian or Native Australian, with the hand on a kangaroo, right? So, kind of representing all of the tropes that we think of Australians. When we move further over here, down here, sort of gazing almost like, admiringly up at Britannia, is this African woman, symbolized by her cornucopia and her dress that, as you can see, is, she's, with one of her breasts out, but it's right below here, right where, Africa is. And you can see there are various, the Gold Coast and Gambia and Lagos, of course, the Cape, or what later becomes, South Africa, regions of Africa that were already colonized by the Brits. We move over here, you have this also kind of tableau of India, right? Beginning with this woman with, the peacock fan. And India, as I mentioned earlier, had long been colonized by the Brits, beginning in the 1600s with it's called East India Company. And the British soldier, the Bengal tiger, you know, think of the Cincinnati Bengals, but, you know, the tiger, the LSU Tigers, the Grambling Tigers. I mean, it's this trope that won't go away, you know, but it all, of course, comes from originally from India. There's the Bay of Bengal, right? The Bengal tiger. So Bengal is right around here in eastern, near where Bangladesh is today. But you see here literally the kind of slave labor of the Indians in the background. So these are all very kind of, again, romanticized, stereotyped visions of the other. And, you know, the British Empire was sort of knowingly and deliberately doing this. Here, when you get to the Americas, right, you see French trappers, you know, this woman here with the fur. She, you know, looks very Caucasian, but that's because, you know, she's either British or French. And there's the male version, you know, with the moose. Think of the moose in Canada. Up here to the Native American or First Peoples. But at the top here, ironically says freedom and fraternity, and over here, federation. Freedom, fraternity, federation. Yeah, well, not for these people. Maybe people in Britain had freedom, fraternity, right? So this kind of, this other image that's on the handout that I mentioned reminds us that Britain here, or really Europe, as Blake was symbolizing it, because this is a colored woodcut engraving by William Blake. He's listed here as the sculptor. Oops, as a sculptor. Excuse me. In the middle is, of course, Europe, and she's being propped up, supported by Africa on the left here, symbolized by the woman who's darker, and then America symbolized by the sort of brownish woman. But notice how while she has like beads or jewelry, maybe pearls or something around her body or neck, they don't have any jewelry really to speak of. What they have instead are symbols of bonds, the slave bond around their arms, right? So you're supported by African America. And this was, as you can see here, 1792, well before the 1886 map. So Blake here was calling attention to the, you know, kind of hypocrisy and irony of British imperialism. So there's one last image I wanted to show you here. I find it. Well, oh, yeah, it's this one. So, you know, we talked here about the partition, but this image here, right? This came from a British publication called Punch, which was a kind of political satire, long-standing in Britain. But you can see here, it's a British soldier standing on the continent of Africa, as if to suggest that Brits, like the statue at Rhodes, the Colossus of Rhodes, it's called, because there was one of these 7 wonders of the world was called the Colossus of Rhodes. Rhodes is a Greek island, so is this large statue, right? And then later there became this belief that there was a statue that was large enough to stand over the what do you call it? The entryway of the Mediterranean between southern Spain and northern Africa. So I could say Morocco. So here's Morocco, right? This country here that was, colonized. Well, let's be honest, it was first colonized by Arabs from the Middle East when after Muhammad's people began the entire kind of colonization of northern Africa. But then it was colonized by, as most of northern Africa was, by France. But you can see here just how close that Gibraltar, that is southern Spain here, and Tangier, or northern Morocco, is. So if I put this on a satellite, you can just see how closely they are. You can, on a clear day, you can see one continent from the other, right? So this is the mouth, if you will, of the Mediterranean Sea, right? And that little separation there separates literally one continent of Europe from another continent, Africa. And there was believed to be, a giant statue that was stepping on, either side, like with 1 foot on Gibraltar and 1 foot on northern Africa. So that's what this image is trying to sort of imitate, if you will. But the reason I want to show you this is, like, the Brits were very well aware of what they were doing, almost like they didn't care that they were exploiting people. Not almost, if they didn't, put it bluntly. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at, after we looked at Barry, let's look at Said himself. But by doing that, we'll look at the question that I'm asking. It's in module 6, or sorry, 7. So this one, letter A, says, and Said clarifies that he, quote, studies Orientalism as dynamic exchange between intellectual authors and the large political concerns shaped by 3 great empires, British, French, American, in whose intellectual and imaginative territory the writing is produced. So that's his quote from page 1877. How is Orientalism a dynamic exchange? He says that right up here. For example, where in literature specifically can we see Orientalism occurring? Right, so when I ask for specific examples, I'm hopefully asking in a literary way, like from what novel or poem or play or short story or whatever. How do you see that occurring? I just gave you an example earlier with Poe, right, of the Apennines and Pedro. Do you even agree that Western culture produces Orientalism? Okay, because he says it is produced. So that's the question. And maybe it might help if I showed you some more images before we look at Said, because he really is all about the imagery. In fact, I'm just going to play, and this is also in your folder. I'm not going to play the whole video here, but there is some, it's a bit blurry. I apologize for that. It's, not my video. But there's some imagery here that will help kind of concretize what it is that Said is talking about. And I'm hoping you will be able to hear the audio. If not, again, this is in your folder. It's only a 10-minute video, but I'm not going to play the whole thing for you. But I want you to notice the first minute or so in which there are a bunch of paintings and movie clips of how the other, capital O, right, is being represented by the Europeans in film or painting and visual art. Well, when luck would have it, this is a big fail. I apologize. So apparently you cannot play a film in Zoom while you are recording. That's unfortunate. Well, let me just show you the images I was going to show you, which is to say a bunch of images that, I don't think you can hear me. All right, sorry, actually a big fail. Apparently you cannot record, so you can play a video inside the Zoom while you're recording a video, which is news to me. So there are a bunch of images in your folder, and I'm just going to wade through a few of them to show you what Said is talking about here. So one of the ways that, what's his name, Said kind of gets at this notion of the other is by talking about ways in which we, Europe, if you will, exoticize, sensualize women from the East and context in the East, right? So here is a woman, and there's typically like you see here, a hookah in the image where she's probably on opium or something like that, being attended to here by people of color, right? Now, the Arabian Nights is something you may have read or heard of, but this is a prime example of what Said is talking about in terms of, you know, the system of producing and publishing these stereotypical notions. So just read the title, right? Arabian Nights Entertainment, or 1001 Nights, accurately describing the manners, customs, laws, and religions of the Eastern nations, right? Lumping them all together. So, you know, it's about, I don't know if you know the story of Scheherazade and her staying awake 1001 nights, not to fall asleep. But the imagery in that text and these paintings, right? Again, there's the hookah, this scantily clad woman. This is what the West views the East or the Orient as. This, you know, again, sensual, exotic, fantastical place where white women in particular were thought to be a prized possession by people of color. This would be like a eunuch standing guard at the harem. And these are all, again, Western painters and artists. These women would have been, what we call concubines in a harem. Harems actually still exist today. Women belong to certain sultans and so on. This is a journalist. But, it's not a thing that has ever gone away. A harem or harem is a place where women would be gathered, living together for the entertainment and pleasure of the sultan. Think of what we call belly dancing or snake charming, right? This is this exoticized notion of what we think they do in the East, or of, these kind of exotic architecture of mosques, or here again of, the belly dancing. And there again is, the hookah. This scimitar, this curved sword, is also indicative of our fascination with the East, the Orient, of not having a straight sword like most Europeans did. And this television show that appeared when I was growing up, it's no longer around, though you can find it on like TV Land and whatnot, called I Dream of Jeannie, was taking that notion of the European genie out of the bottle, right? And whitewashing it and stereotyping it to the nth degree for American viewership. She comes out of a bottle, as the prologue to every episode showed, as a genie does. This is the German version of it, syndicated in CD form. But these tropes are still with us. This is, you can see it's a British, in the UK, in Nottingham, a British lounge, presenting Shangri-La Lounge, Arabian Nights, so that, again, the West appropriates these cultural constructs and uses it for its own purpose. Or here, this actual film called Arabian Nights, again, a kind of spin-off and retelling of the supposed Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights that you saw earlier. But look at the imagery here on the movie poster, right? It's the, Caucasian, strong white guy who's rescuing the imperiled Caucasian woman from the likes of, the swarthy, dark Arab, perhaps, right? Or person from the East. That's how these films are portrayed. Same thing of Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, right? There's, John Hall, right here, the actor, rescuing Marie Montanez. And from, these thieves, and you can again see, how they're represented here. So it's very deeply embedded in our culture, right? Here's an Arabian Nights graphic comic version, or graphic novel version, right? Of Sinbad, and look how he's portrayed as dark and menacing to this white woman. Is again the scimitar, curved sword, and this very kind of centralized, over sexualized notion of the person from the East. She says, "Why don't we let that wait until morning? I'm sure there are better ways for us to celebrate our newfound friendship." And he, in this very kind of almost grotesque representation, really, says, "I might have just a few ideas," right? Again, it's a very kind of, and you're not sure, is he African, is he Arabic, but he's certainly other, capital O, right? There again, part of the Mason iconography, Daughters of the Nile, right? The scimitar and the crescent moon. There's the Aladdin's lamp, out of which the genie comes. And in fact, the genie or the jinn itself, you can see that word right down here, jinn, Jinn, that's where we get the word genie, was in fact, or still is, a Middle Eastern concept of like a demon, right? Might say it's a fallen angel or something, but we kind of distorted it, reinterpreted it for our own Western ends to, that genie that comes out of the bottle into something like this, out of Aladdin's lamp that, Disney has kind of captivated young minds with, or even Whoopi in her iteration of being a genie has shown us. So that's partly what Said is talking about. Another way to think about this is in my favorite play of Othello, which is really ripe for thinking about post-colonial criticism. So Shakespeare here, this is probably the most accurate portrait of him. He has this play called Othello, the Moor of Venice, right? That word Moor coming from the word Morocco, right? So the first act of the play is set in Venice, Europe proper. And then the remaining 4 acts are set on this island near and just off the coast of, the Middle East proper and off the coast of Turkey called Cyprus. And therefore it's a kind of exotic place for the rest of the play. And in, this play, Cyprus is part of what then would have been called the Ottoman Empire, whom Othello and others are sent to fight, the Ottomans. But notice here in Northern Africa, it is also known as the Barbary Coast, which is where we get that word barbarian. That is, those who were pirates and were uncouth and did not practice Catholicism or Christianity. But part of the anxiety of this play is that a Caucasian woman would be stolen by the Ottomans or the Turks or the Orient, and sold into slavery, right? As this image is depicting. And this is not a Middle Eastern painting, but this is a European painting of what is supposedly happening to white women, or like here, being like checked for health, like a horse or, an animal you might buy. Again, in the harem with the hookah, white women were thought to be prized possessions, and therefore in human trafficking, as we might call it today, were, being, we might otherwise say, manifested as a cultural anxiety by the West or by Europeans. So these are the images that Said is talking about how we, the West, have constructed the Orient and the Oriental as being other. And it comes out in this play where Othello, whom we're not sure if he's Arabic or African, but he's certainly in love with and elopes with a Caucasian or white woman. So it's a text, right, where you can point very specifically to a kind of Orientalism that's going on in the play. And of course, it's a tragedy, therefore someone must die. And I won't give you a spoiler alert, but several people die. Anyhow, so this is the other kind of thing that Said is talking about. And let's look at Said proper after this question. He was, as I mentioned, he was born in Palestine, which is a group of peoples that are Muslim and Arabic and heritage. Sorry about that. That's annoying. Gosh, I apologize for that. Emergency alert. I have no control over that. So he was, born in Jerusalem, right, which is a city under contestation by 3 religions. And so he had a very different experience, which is I was trying to show you in that video that didn't pan out, that his experience is not what when he came to the United States and he, attended Princeton and later Harvard. That was not what he was seeing in all this, film and media and imagery. You're saying, this is not my experience of being a Middle Easterner or a Palestinian, right? So he begins to develop this theory of Orientalism that has a huge influence on postcolonial theory. Right, he says here, as he remarked in an interview, however, he always experienced his identity as complicated as a US citizen as well as a Palestinian. So there's that hybridity, right? As an Oriental as well as a Western scholar educated in the British tradition, and as a renowned academic figure as well as an often dissenting political spokesperson. He was influenced by Foucault, and if you remember way back when we talked about post-structuralist theory, along with there, Foucault is very interested in systems of power, institutional systems of power like prisons and courts and so on. So he's kind of takes his, Said takes his mark from Foucault and looks at it in a very, again, systemic way. He says here, really, this is the editor's, Norton Anthology editor's introduction, where they say, in our first selection, Said propounds a broad definition of Orientalism, encompassing both Western academic scholarship and discipline whose fields of study is the Orient, such as anthropology, philology, history, and area studies, and the general Western image of the Orient depicted in novels, political accounts, and contemporary media. He shows how Western writers, archaeologists, linguists, historians, and politicians from the 18th century to the present day have discovered, notice that word's in quotation marks, like Columbus discovering, Caribbean islands, which had already been discovered, and in a sense invented the Orient. According to Said, Orientalism reveals more about the West and its fantasies than it does about the actual people, culture, and history of the East. Not simply as a myth, it is more particularly valuable as a sign of European Atlantic power over the Orient than it is as a veridic discourse about the Orient. In effect, the various literary, cultural, and historical discourses of Orientalism participate in the conquest and continuing subjugation of the East. In other words, it continues to this day, unfortunately. Furthermore, Said's analysis is a sharp warning to scholars and intellectuals, showing how scholarship is sometimes informed by racism and how intellectuals have been complicit in the administration of imperial power. The examination of Orientalism is particularly indebted to the works of Foucault, as Said adopts Foucault's method of archival research, especially in the history of sexuality and the punish and discipline works. His focus on cultural and historical knowledges as constituting a system of discourse, and his tracing of the complex interrelation of power and knowledge. So back when I asked this question, right, when he says that it's a dynamic exchange, and then I ask you, well, so how is Orientalism a dynamic exchange? He's saying here, right, that it's a complex interrelation of power and knowledge. right? It's not just knowing things, but how the knowledge is put to use. What may help you to think about the, let's say, the Occident, the West versus the Orient, the East, is Derrida's notion of center and periphery when he was, deconstructing the sign. Another post-structuralist influence is Derrida's critique of concepts such as center and margin and self and other. For Said, the margin of the East helps define the colonial center of the West, right? The center would be the West, the margin or periphery would be the East, and the Oriental other is a projection of the Western view that it constructs. So maybe that is a nice tie-in or help for you. And I just mentioned this earlier about Mansfield Park, where Sir Bertram or Lord Bertram, has to go to the Caribbean, in this case to Antigua, to manage his plantation. But, that's about all that's really kind of said. And we have to, apply a little pressure there. Anyway, so let's look at what Said actually says. I'm going to start, I think, on 1444. Oh, no, sorry, that's Fanon. Here, this is on 1875. Before we get that quote, we're leading up to that quote that is in the question, letter A question, that occurs here on page 1877, right? So this is the quotation about British, French, and American. And I ask you, here it is. When I study Orientalism, it's a dynamic exchange. I'm saying, okay, well, what is a dynamic exchange? Might help to go back and read what he says earlier in this long section here. He says, therefore, Orientalism is not a mere political subject matter or field that is reflected passively by culture, scholarship, or institutions, right? So it's not passive. It's actively produced by society and culture. Nor is it a large and diffuse collection of text about the Orient, nor is it representative and expressive of some nefarious or negative Western imperialist plot to hold down the Oriental world. It is rather a distribution of geopolitical awareness into aesthetic, scholarly, economic, sociological, historical, and philosophical texts, right? So when he says later, I call it a dynamic exchange, right? This is what he's talking about, this distribution of geopolitical awareness of all these different, what you might call intersectional disciplines or categories. It is an elaboration not only of a basic geographical distinction, the world is made up of two unequal halves, Orient and Occident, but also of a whole series of interests, which by such means as scholarly discovery, philological reconstruction, meaning language reconstruction, psychological analysis, landscape and sociological description, it not only creates, but also maintains. That's important, that it not only produces a certain ideological perspective, but it also, in that construction, maintains and holds within sight of it, right? Think of the center again, this idea of, say, the East or the Orient or the other. It is, rather than expresses, a certain will or intention to understand, in some cases to control, manipulate, even to incorporate what is a manifestly or clearly different or alternative and novel, meaning new, world. It is above all a discourse that is by no means in direct corresponding relationship with political power in the raw, but rather is produced and exists in an uneven exchange with various kinds of power, shaped to a certain degree by the exchange with power political, as with a colonial or imperial establishment, power intellectual, as with reigning sciences like comparative linguistics or anatomy or any of the modern policy sciences, power cultural, as with orthodoxies and canons of taste, text, and values, power moral, as with ideas, and so on, right? So he's, what is that dynamic exchange again? He's listing it all right here for you. This distribution. And then because Orientalism is a cultural and a political fact, then it does not exist in some archival vacuum, like in a library, sealed away. It exists in the real world, he's saying. Quite the contrary. I think it can be shown that what is thought, said, or even done about the Orient follows, perhaps occurs within certain distinct and intellectually knowable lines, the lines of thought or discourse. So I don't think after you read that it's too difficult to look at this statement where he says, it's a dynamic exchange, and these great empires help produce that dynamic exchange, right? So let's move on to the second question, and that is about Frantz Fanon. So remember, Frantz Fanon comes earlier than Said, and he's working out some issues of nationalism and national identity that becomes hugely influential in postcolonial theory and study. So he has this on page 1438, this quotation. And, I give it to you, but I then complicate what he's trying to say because it's not as sort of nice and tidy as you might want to have it. He says that, well, sorry, I misspoke. This is by the editors of the Norton Anthology that I'm quoting here, but it's really about what he says in his essay, as we'll see, that they, the African people, because really, again, he's interested in Algiers at the time, Algeria, they court disaster, right? French colonized or African colonized countries and people, they court disaster if they simply replace their white colonial bourgeois leaders with Black African post-colonial bourgeoisie, while leaving the basic class structure of the societies in place. So he says, people should not, if, say, in Africa, right? If you go back to this image here that I showed you earlier about the partition. In pink here, where French colonists were in large chunks of Saharan Africa, were colonizing, say, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, later, Cameroon. He's saying these people, and really it can be applied to any one of these African countries, but he's, Fanon focusing on the French inflected because, again, Martinique was colonized by the French in the Caribbean, and, he speaks fluent French, of course. He's saying these people should not simply, as he puts it, or they put it, simply replace their white colonial leaders, right? That is the French leaders who have colonized, say, Algeria, with Black African bourgeoisie. Now, this reminds us, as I say here, of Marx, that Marx was concerned about class issues. And remember, the bourgeoisie are those who own the means of production, what we might construe as, the top 10% or 1%, certainly not the 99%. And he's saying, look, you're going to run into the same governing and nationalist problems if you simply replace these guys with, the same class of people, but they just happen to be Black and African, born in Africa. So I then go on to say, but how might people of color, whether Africans or people of African descent, right? Or take it out of Africa for that matter, you could say, or Hispanics, Native Americans, right? You could broaden the question or, relocate the question. How might people of color begin to replace their oppressed cultural past while simultaneously trying to remain connected, international, and cosmopolitan? I asked that question because in Fanon's piece, we're going to look at here, he says on 1446, he says, or I say, that is, if Fanon urges these African countries to develop a national consciousness of their own, which he wants them to do, how can they achieve that if, quote, every independent nation in Africa where colonialism is still entrenched is an encircled nation, a nation which is fragile and in permanent danger? So think about this. On the one hand, he wants countries to become connected and international and cosmopolitan, right? To have a sense of where they are in relation to the rest of the world, right? Which is, what international means, so you're not isolated, like, Trump wanted America to pull out of NATO, it certainly pulled out of the Paris climate agreement and, become isolationist, we call it. So not that way, but the other way, to go outward, to be, very involved in the world, and also know your place and your heritage in the world. So how do you do that while, he says, every nation in Africa where colonialism is still entrenched? Well, look at that image that I just showed you. Pretty much every country in Africa owes an indebtedness to some colonial power. So in the Congo, it's here in purple, it's the Belgians, right? In, say, what is today Ethiopia, right? That is indebted to, African independent states, but they had their own way of colonizing those indigenous people as well. Or of, I don't know, let's look at Cameroon, right? Well, no, that's Cameroon is what orange is. German. So every one of these regions, countries, right, has some colonial baggage, shall we say. And he says, therefore, that is a country that is an encircled nation, meaning there's already a kind of both mental and physical border around that territory of that group of people, and is therefore a nation which is fragile and in permanent danger, right? Kind of, going back to this notion, like, don't simply replace these guys, the current colonial bourgeois leaders, the Caucasian upper class leaders, with simply, the upper class aristocratic Black Africans, right? So remember, in this work, The Wretched of the Earth, this excerpt we're looking at comes from chapter 4. And so, as they tell us here in the introduction, he was born to a middle-class family on the island of Martinique, right? And he became intellectually attuned to with the problems of colonialism and racism. And so he's living, this is published in 61, but, he actually served in World War II and was very, very aware of European and France's involvement in World War II. Remember, France was occupied by Nazi Germany. So he says here, or really the introductory Norton Anthology says, perhaps the most important aspect of Fanon's political thought was its insight into the complex interaction in the colonies between class and race, right? So think of bourgeois, the owners of the means of production versus the laborers, the proletariat, Marxist terms, and race. People of color versus the Caucasians, Europeans. Though he was intensely aware of the centrality of racism to European colonialism, Fanon, as a Marxist, right? Good thing we talked about Marx last time, argued that social, economic, and political oppression in the Third World was equally a matter of class. In other words, he didn't want to just think about race, he wanted to inject class into that. So we have in sociology terms like socioeconomic, that wants to have both issues of society, which involves, of course, race and class, wealth, or economics. He makes this point most forcefully in his influential argument, The Wretched of the Earth, that post-colonial African nations court disaster if they simply replace their white colonial bourgeois leaders with a Black African post-colonial bourgeoisie, while leaving the basic class structure of the societies in place. That's the quotation that comes in letter B, if you want to answer the question, letter B. So our section, again, comes from chapter 4, it's called On National Culture. In the chapter on national culture, Fanon examines nationalism, exploring the role played by culture in the development of viable post-colonial identities for emergent African nations. Here, he particularly concentrates on the importance of intellectuals as well as the arts in helping to develop cultural identities for emerging post-colonial nations. So he talks a bit about jazz, for instance. He urges African intellectuals to join actively in the anti-colonial struggle and to place the building of new post-colonial national identities at the very center of their work. In fact, this was, as they point out down here, this work was very important in the Black Power movement in the 1960s. At the same time, he warns these intellectuals to remain aware that the new nation, and here's where the complication comes in, here's where the new nation must exist within an international community, right? Don't be isolationists. As they pursue national culture, which is, within its own borders, they should draw their strength from the African masses, but reject isolationist or traditionalist solutions. They must maintain an understanding of a sense of connection to the outside world. So this is exactly what I was asking you here in this question. So, okay, yes, replace the white bourgeois leaders with, African national leaders. But how do you do that if he says, every single nation that is, where colonialism is still entrenched is a nation that's fragile and in permanent danger? Because, it's like wanting to have it both ways. In other words, you want to develop, what he calls a national consciousness, sense of your own identity, not imposed on you from without by the colonists. And at the same time, he wants the people in that nation to have, an outward connected international cosmopolitan notion of where they fit in the world. So if we look at page, I believe it's 1444. He says here, now this movement tends more and more to express itself objectively in institutions. From thence comes the need for national existence, whatever the cost. And he's really here talking about the movement to undermine colonialism and develop your own national identity. A frequent mistake, and one which is moreover hardly justifiable, is to try to find cultural expressions for and to give new values to native culture within the framework of colonial domination. That is why, when we arrive at a proposition, which at first sight seems paradoxical, the fact that in a colonized country, the most elementary, most savage, and the most undifferentiated nationalism is the most fervent and efficient means of defending national culture, which is kind of true, right? That the most kind of blatant display of nationalism, like we are Cameroonians or we are Nigerians or we are, you know, whatever, well, not too long ago, ISIS or ISIL, it comes in a very kind of, he says elementary, but, you know, could be rudimentary, fundamental, kind of crass, barbaric, or as he says, savage form, right? Which he's not wanting. In the colonial situation, culture, which is doubly deprived of the support of the nation and state, falls away and dies, right? That is, in the colonist project, they're really not concerned with any native or indigenous culture. In fact, they'd rather it be assimilated and fall away and die, right? The condition for its existence is therefore national liberation and the renaissance or rebirth of the state, right? So if we want to have actual national culture, then there needs to be a rebirth, he says, right? The nation is not only the condition of culture, its fruitfulness, its continuous renewal, and its deepening. It is also it is also a necessity, right? It says the nation is a necessity. It is the fight for national existence, which sets culture moving and opens it to the doors of creation. And then, after saying it's a necessity, he gives this example of, where is it? Right here. He says, national consciousness, which is not nationalism, and let me just parse that out for you. National consciousness is being aware of your culture, your history even before there was any written history of it, of your current state, of your future prospects, and so on. Nationalism is closely allied with what we might call patriotism, of this kind of flag waving, like, oh, we are Americans at the Olympics, right? That is not the same thing as having a sense of your national consciousness. So, you know, here's, you know, a good example. During the whole Colin Kaepernick sitting or kneeling issue, when Trump reprimands and admonishes him publicly for not standing for the national anthem, Trump was practicing and promoting a kind of nationalism, a patriotism, right? You need to do it for the flag and for the country, right? But of course, in the broader context, Kaepernick was doing it out of a kind of deep awareness of national consciousness, of racial injustice that still goes unanswered, okay? National consciousness, which is not nationalism, is the only thing that will give us an international dimension. Going back to that notion of, as I said in the question, right, of connected international and cosmopolitan. This is a problem of national consciousness and of national culture, and of a national culture takes on in Africa a special dimension. The rebirth of national consciousness in Africa has a strictly contemporaneous, meaning happening at the same time, connection with the African consciousness. And what he's saying here, and this is 1961, that it hadn't been, that map I showed you earlier was the 1914 scramble for Africa, or the African partition. It hadn't been that many decades that, from say 1914 to 1961 and after World War II, that countries in Africa began to develop their own sense of identity. We are Nigerian, we are Kenyan, we are Egyptian, and so on. And so he's saying that while that is contemporaneously happening of, this African consciousness, there is also a rebirth, right? What it means to be African on the continent of Africa. So it's a sense of national identity, like, oh, we are Kenyan, oh, we are Nigerian, or South African, or whatever, but it's also, oh, we are also African on the African continent, which, is in a broader, again, kind of international dimension. The responsibility of the African as regards national culture is also a responsibility with regard to African Negro culture. This joint responsibility is not the fact of a metaphysical principle, like, it comes from a higher mandate like God, but the awareness of a simple rule which wills that every independent nation in an Africa where colonialism is still entrenched is an encircled nation, a nation which is fragile and in permanent danger, right? So he's saying, it's a precarious thing, touchy and delicate thing. The instance I mentioned earlier of jazz is, I think, worth mentioning. So, jazz has its roots going back all the way to Western Africa, then into the Caribbean, and then into, the Gulf of Mexico basin, specifically New Orleans. So there are all these kind of layers to it. And there's a certain kind of jazz, intertwined, indebted to, say, blues, right? That he's kind of referring to here. He says, the colonialist specialists do not recognize these new forms, and he's talking here about really art in general, these new forms, and rush to the help of the traditions of the indigenous society. It is the colonialists who become the defenders of the native style. So keep this in mind. This is kind of what Said is also saying, but from an Orientalist perspective, that there's a way in which once jazz or blues or rhythm and blues is produced, it is the Caucasian, the colonizers, the hegemony, if you will, that wants it not to be messed with. Like, we want to preserve, what jazz is. A great example of this is Ken Burns, who's a white historian, created this very detailed, multiple episode history of jazz in the United States. This is exactly what Fanon is talking about. We remember perfectly, and the example took on a certain measure of importance since the real nature of colonialism was not involved in the reactions of the white jazz specialists when, after the Second World War, new styles such as the bebop took definite shape, right? That jazz, as music does and genres do, begin to evolve and morph. There was rap, and then it's hip hop, and there's all manner of variation thereof. This is this fact is that in their eyes, meaning in the white jazz specialist eyes, in their eyes, jazz should only be the despairing, broken down nostalgia of an old Negro who is trapped between 5 glasses of whiskey, like the blues, the curse of his race, the racial hatred of the white man. And that's how these white jazz specialists wanted to keep it, right? As soon as the Negro comes to an understanding of himself and understands the rest of the world differently, when he gives birth to hope and forces back the racist universe, it is clear that his trumpet sounds more clearly and his voice less hoarsely. The new fashions in jazz are not simply born of economic competition, which music studio will produce you. We must, without any doubt, see them in one of the consequences of the defeat, slow but sure, of the Southern world of the United States. And it is not utopian to suppose that in 50 years' time, the type of jazz howl hiccuped by a poor, misfortunate Negro will be upheld only by the whites who believe in it as an expression of negritude and who are faithful to this arrested image of a type of relationship. And again, I can't, put it more concretely than this. I think it's on Netflix. I could be wrong. It's a television miniseries, right? Or maybe it's even on PBS, right? Because it should belong to the public. So there you go, right? There's this multi-part, kind of trajectory of jazz. Yeah. So if you haven't checked it out, check it out. Maybe. It's it's got a lot of history there, but it kind of reifies or reinforces exactly what Fanon is saying here about what those who believe in it as an expression of negritude, right, are faithful to arresting the image, of stopping it, like let's put it in a museum now. Let's not let it evolve. So that kind of completes the question on Fanon. And the last question is, as I often do, kind of trying to complicate the whole approach to whichever theory. In this case, I'm asking about, what are the problems of postcolonial theory? So it says, one of the pervasive critiques of postcolonial theory is predicated or based upon the insidious or slow-moving, imperceptible nature of its othering effect, of producing the subaltern, which is also the other, of reinforcing alterity or otherness, that it happens in this slow, gradual, like, how are we really sure it's happening, right? Way. How and or in what ways or way can we detect a manifestation of the subaltern? Where can we see it revealed, or the other in Western culture, whether through specific examples in art, architecture, literature, film, or politics? Again, if you watch that video clip in the, what do you call it, the folder, you'll see that it's pretty, manifestly clear the way that we represent people who are other. It's in that Saeed here, this video, the one that wouldn't play earlier, but you can play it either in the folder or download it if you want, if it will ever catch up. And these kinds of images, right? Of the other being, you know, the bad guy, and the white Western guy always triumphs, you know. So that's available for you to watch if you want. And so when I say, you know, where can we find it in specific examples of art, literature, film, and so on, that's exactly what I mean. Specific examples, folks, right? Don't just mention it broadly and in passing, say, when they say this or when they do this, right? You know, be specific. But then I say, but isn't such an insistence on the insidious existence that, you know, it must happen this way in a slow, gradual, secret, stealthy way, isn't insistence on the other yet another example of being always already locked in a particular ideology? And ideology, if you remember, like the Matrix, is this upside down camera obscura way of thinking, a false consciousness. So again, one of the critiques is that this othering happens, and if you insist that, you know, it must happen, then isn't that really a kind of already boxed in way of viewing postcolonial theory? In other words, there's no way out of it because Marx gave us this notion of ideology. All right, folks, that was apologies for long-winded and not entirely smooth video lecture, but hopefully it helps you, and I will post that later today here in module 7. All right, take care. Hope you all are well. Ciao.